Minde is our second intra-domestic as opposed to bi-coastal partnership, and their work spans more than geography. It includes pedagogy, architecture, interior design, landscape, installation, furniture design, and fabrication. Their Boxcar project is a mixed-use theater, restaurant, and residential project in Omaha, and is conceptually constructed from units, just as their furniture, the 3-4-5 table, is. There's a separation of related but independent forms that are assembled into an intelligent whole. Indeed, this might be a description of their practice, as the varied interests and backgrounds of Jeffrey Day and E.B. Min are assembled into a coherent and very, very thoughtful body of work.
Okay. Hi. We just want to also say thank you so much, Billy, for that introduction. That was a very nice way of putting it in our work, coherent and disparate. And thank you very much to the Arc League and Anne and Matt for selecting us. We are so honored to be included in Emerging Voices this year. So we'll go ahead and start. I am E.B. Min.
I'm Jeff Day.
And as mentioned, we have a practice that's located both in San Francisco and
In Omaha, Nebraska. That's actually a slide of Denver, but it's close enough.
Wow, close enough.
Halfway.
Okay. So I think often we were asked, why did we do this? But one of the answers that we like to give is that we established our office in these two locations because I think much like Silo, and in fact a lot of the ideas that we have, we share in common with you guys, is this belief that establishing offices in such two disparate locations would yield a perspective for us that would transcend the limits of regional specificity. We're interested in not being tagged, as you guys are, also interested, as regional architects, but really thinking about how we have more of a sort of national design identity.
So this image is a visual touchstone for the office. It captures a relationship to building that is both dynamic and evolving and governed by a really straightforward practicality as well as a risky experimentation. And so for us, it suggests a both-and approach to architectural practice that accepts the circumstantial as well as the ideal. And we find this approach to be in contrast to a much more familiar trope of modernism, where architecture is seen as a device that isolates the subject from the object. And so the White Cube, of course, we all know from Brian O'Doherty's Inside the White Cube, published it first in Art Form in 1976. In the essay, he succinctly traces the development of this ubiquitous form of the neutral white gallery from its roots in easel painting and the frame, both devices that separate the artwork from the world and its surrounding context. So this ideology of neutrality attempts to reinforce the object quality of the artwork and establish its autonomy from its surroundings as well as from the viewing subject. And for us, a critique of the White Cube is both literal, so when it's applied to a space for art or a gallery or theater, some places like that, but also metaphorical in that we think of our relationship to modernism and the discipline of architecture. This is a challenge that we approach. So one of the projects, an early project that exemplifies this for us, is the work we've done with Art Farm. Art Farm is an art residency program in rural Nebraska. We began our relationship with Art Farm at about the same time we established Minde, and it's been a very long-term, ongoing relationship working with the facility. We began by developing a framework plan, and then part of that plan suggested that the art farm needed a public space, and we proposed a gallery as a sort of function that could serve as a nexus for the public in what is really a private place for artists to work. And so working with Art Farm, we purchased this barn for $1,000 and spent about $6,000 moving it approximately 3 miles from a defunct family farm to the Art Farm, which is really how Art Farm has come to be, a collection of lonely buildings moving together to have a new life. But we were so taken with the levitating barn that we changed our original design so that we could project the barn as sort of forever floating above this horizontal landscape of the Great Plains. The gallery within is sort of decomposed white cube, if you will, contained within the partially restored and stabilized barn. And the project suggests a form of flexibility without neutrality, removing the neutral and allowing the work presented within to exhibit both a presence within the frame, but also a sense of the context and the surrounding landscape, and of course the barn itself. So we promote widely through our work an approach to flexibility not as the absence of form, but as the presence of a unique and carefully considered infrastructure, affording individuals the power to manipulate their own environment while simultaneously instilling a distinct personality derived from our own design process. So in a sense, this is an architecture as a frame that connects rather than separates. And it's an open-ended approach to architecture that serves both long-term relationships with clients, unique partnerships, as well as more conventional commissioned work.
And then I also wanted to just mention why I also consider this a touchstone image for the practice. And differing with Jeff a little bit, I'm the one who maintains the San Francisco office, and I'm complete, product of my urban environment. And so when we started working out in the Midwest, what I really benefited from was seeing this image. I remember when I saw it, I was so struck by the fact that the barn was moving, but also when we met everybody out in the Midwest, I was really struck by the attitude there was towards architecture. I had been working for actually a landscape design build firm run by Topher Delaney and Andrea Cochran for 3 years. And when I'd worked for them, I was really taken by the amount of improvisation that we had to do in the field and how all your best laid plans never actually worked out. But they were still able to maintain a high sense of design. And so seeing this barn seemed to epitomize to me everything that maybe I felt was wrong with architecture, that there was really maybe not that much control in the end, and we should be a lot more loose in our approach. So in that, we've thought about our work as a combination of being both farmer and cowboy. And so what we mean by that is that we think that architects in general, you have to be like sort of really detail oriented and also to be able to see the big picture, be able to exert a lot of control, yet also be able to design on the fly. So we see farmers and cowboys as these examples of opposites that require sort of both and approach for architects. For the farmer, we learn to work with established frameworks to address change with expediency and directness. But the cowboy can inform us about how we should improvise and take risks and redefine the conditions in which we work. Embracing both these tendencies affords our practice the capability to adapt to circumstance to produce work that is both in itself flexible and open-ended, while oscillating between precise control, what we like to call tight fit, and controlled imprecision, which is what we like to call loose fit. And this is we like to also have a nod to Dave Hickey's essay about pirates and farmers, because obviously we're thinking about that, but instead of supposing that you're one or the other, we're saying that I think all of us have a little bit of the cowboy and farmer in us.
So when we put together our new or most recent website, we started to see these tendencies operating together in a collection of work that at first appears very disparate, but then appears through a bit more consideration to exhibit these tendencies operating back and forth at different points in the different projects. So on the one hand, we have some projects that are more in the sort of tight fit vein where we're detailing very carefully, very controlled sense of experience through the architecture. And in another case, we're looking at work that, stay on that one for a second, where we have less control, where we're open to improvisations, more interesting partnerships, and where the inhabitation of the project itself changes its function and in many cases actually literally changes its form. However, these tendencies are still present in both cases, but that there is a sense of a continuum, I guess, in the way the work starts to come together around these approaches to design.
So we'd like to talk about a couple of projects that really do form the basis of our approach to our work. The first one is the house on Lake Okoboji. This is a house that we did fairly early in our practice, and it is a total example of this tight fit, but also embodies a lot of the themes and issues that have informed our practice since then. It's about a 6,000 square foot vacation home on West Lake Okoboji, which is in the northwest corner of Iowa. And when we got the commission as young architects, we were super excited. We thought, wow, we're going to do this lake house, and it's going to be this beautiful site, and it's going to be wooded. And then we got to the site. We were like, oh, I see. And so we had no idea that it was going to be this really sort of almost semi-suburban site in the middle of cornfields, where it was all super built up, and we only had 100 feet of shoreline to work with in this pie-shaped lot. And our challenge was the clients, who were terrific, had said to us, we want privacy, and we want you to make it all about the lake. So we really had quite a challenge to figure out how to do that without looking at all the other houses. So how did we figure out how to sort of strip this down to really focus on the trees, which we wanted to preserve on the site, and the landscape? And I think in the house design we came up with, you can see we can see the sort of themes that we have continued to work with. One is we really created this sort of nestled mute box as our approach to the design, which then allowed us to really explore some interior dynamics when we couldn't really do a lot of work on the exterior, given the site constraints. By being able to do this, we created a house that is very deceptively simple in its overall form, and then allowed for different types of spaces to occur through a series of framing devices that would really be very selective in focusing how you experience the lake and the view. So you can see in this diagram, this really talks about the public spaces in the house, and how as you enter from the road, it opens up to the view, but very selectively hiding the neighbors to the north and south. And then the kitchen, for instance, the only daylight that comes in is this gigantic skylight from the second floor. But then as we get upstairs, we're able to sort of reframe the views to be internal through these sort of spatial tubes that both look from spaces within the building to the exterior. And then we just sort of have a series of how you can see as we move through the house. There's, again, this series of framing devices. But one of the other major themes that occurred in this house was our interest in material and color. And in the house, one of the things that we approached with materiality was using materials that aren't precious, but to use them in a very deliberate and designed way. The materials that are in the house include polycarbonate, OSB, off-the-shelf steel grating, plastic laminate, and plywood. And those materials, we ended up using both that and color to sort of really emphasize more intimate spaces in the house. In the public areas, they're usually mapped or related to the views, but in the more private spaces that are more internal, we were really trying to use material to create a more interesting visual and spatial experience. Here's a playroom for the kids, lined in OSB. But we also ended up using color to really define the most intimate spaces of the house, which are the bathrooms. So from afar, you can see we use a monolithic color, but the materials are all quite different. So once you're in the space, there's a textural difference within the space itself. We were also, the third thing we got very interested in was create fabrication and custom design. And this is our first foray into incorporating digital tools into our design work. We were very interested in expanding our toolbox and had technique in designing furniture. And this is a headboard that we designed for the project. It's about 11 feet long and 6 feet tall, and it's made out of stacked Baltic birch plywood. We were very interested in this tension between seeing the material and how it's stacked in a way that you didn't normally think of plywood, and the sort of tension between both analog and digital craft. And it's also a functional piece as it has storage behind it. We were also able to design some other custom pieces, such as the dining table, which we call the lake dining table, and this coffee table that goes from a square to a circle. And these are made out of solid strips of white oak.
So exemplifying the opposite trend, the loose fit project, the Bemis Center for Contemporary Arts is another long-term client that we've worked with for many years, very similar to Art Farm, but the sort of urban example of Art Farm. This is an art residency program in Omaha, Nebraska. They house about 24 artists a year. It's very, very competitive to enter. And we've been working with the Bemis for probably 10 years on various projects, starting with master plans. And in fact, we've outlived 4 executive directors and 3 turnovers of the entire staff. So our relationship is longer than our clients have existed, which is a weird condition to be in. But it's really become a dialogue with this building and a building across the street. This is also an opportunity for us to work with students. So we started a design-build organization at the University of Nebraska called Fabrication and Construction Team, which is a design-build class, but it also operates more or less as a nonprofit. We take on typically small projects that we can fabricate with digital fabrication or other sort of advanced techniques, and sometimes very unique partnerships, which is a critical part of this. So this is an early rendering of part of the master plan. And the master plan included art residence studios, workshops, galleries, outdoor space, gardens for the artists to actually grow their own food, and public space in addition to that. Within the first floor of the main building, this is gallery space. There's a small video art cinema, and then 3 components that were actually designed and built with the students. One is a gallery, one's the vestibule, and one is a garden. So the Bemis Info Shop is the entry space. One of the things we recognized in the master plan that when the Bemis was first built, galleries were accessed directly from the street. There was no transition. There was no place for dialogue. In fact, there was absolutely no place for a patron to sit down unless they wanted to sit cross-legged on the floor. So our project began with identifying this zone of space at the beginning of the entry into the facility. It's an old former dry goods warehouse with a rigorous column grid. The column grid can be very challenging for gallery space, but was not a problem for us at the entry. We carved out this area of space. You can see the garden down below on the loading dock. And created a zone where we call it the info shop because it's really a space of dialogue. It's a social condenser, and it's not a place for this display of artwork. It's dominated by this 24-foot-long desk made of edge-laminated masonite, which is a mistake. I wouldn't do that again, but it requires constant waxing. And then wall panels that we created with a script that the students helped us write and fabricate. So the entire project is composed from a pinwheel aperiodic tiling pattern, which is based on a right triangle that can repeat infinitely in a kind of embedded fashion. The sort of dashed lines are the sort of components of the pattern that we selected for the main wall, with the red pieces being inflection points. And then with another script, we identified areas and ways of controlling the density of the pattern so that some areas have smaller scale components and some of the triangles and some are more smooth and laid out. And so in the end, it becomes a very sort of complex surface that changes from one side to the next and highlights certain areas within the project. And so we basically take this 2-dimensional pattern and sort of extrude it into sort of 2.5D on the wall and then fully into 3 dimensions with the desk. So it's all emerging out of the same geometric parameters. The finished piece, it's painted MDF. Students did all the framing and installed everything. We got to a point at the end of the scripting process and realizing that we needed to mill about 35 sheets of MDF, and we have a small, this is not our router, we have a small router in the school, and it would have booked it for an entire semester, which wasn't something that was available to us. So we looked around town for another router, and we found this one, which happens to be in a state prison. So we worked with inmates at a medium security state prison. I'm not allowed to actually show pictures of the real inmates, so this is just a stand-in. But the inmates did all the milling, and the students would have to email code. Obviously, they couldn't go in and out of the shop. We did go to the shop once, but it involved a lot of background security checks and pat-downs, so we didn't want to do that every day. So it involved emailing back and forth, and then, of course, the panels were delivered to us not by the inmates, but by other people, and then the students installed them, obeying every OSHA guideline as we completed the project. Hopefully there's no OSHA inspectors in the house, but so the finished piece operates as a sort of hinge between the galleries and the exterior space. You can see the garden through the window. The garden actually came later, about a year later. A grant, the institution came to a grant to build this publicly owned private outdoor space. And I mean that literally. It's actually public space, but operated by the museum on the loading dock, which is part of the public property outside of the building. Instead of designing this ourselves, we decided to host a series of 14 charrettes in the gallery. We turned a gallery into an exhibition, but also a space of design and dialogue, and spent an entire summer talking about public open space, landscape inside the city of Omaha, fabrication, sometimes specifically talking about the project, sometimes talking about grander urban design issues. And students would work every week to sort of realize those ideas from one week to the next charrette, and then another group of artists would come in and run a charrette. And so in the end, we built the garden at the very end of this summer, which is composed of native plant material, crushed auto glass for mulch, salvaged brick, and so on. So I think this is the project that we like to say has the most conversation per square foot of construction of anything that we've ever done. Another piece is the Bemis soft cube. Todd Williams actually spoke here on a lecture a few years ago. This was a conversion of one of the galleries to be really more of a supportive space for performance and event. It works as a series of infrastructural devices that support activities. There's a stage, there's a fan to convince people that there's air conditioning when there really isn't. There's this acoustical baffled wall, which functions as an acoustical baffle. That was its primary need, primary means. It also works as a bench and an ambient light fixture for the space. This was built, again, with students for about $1,500 using CDX plywood and Homosote, which we sanded by hand. You can see the surface being installed, and then in the end. So what we liked about this piece was the fact that when you look at it straight on, it appears very stable and flat because of the orientation of the striations, but then from certain angles you can see the sort of potato chip form starts to emerge and become really dynamic. And so it transforms a gallery from a place of display to a place of social engagement and dialogue, and again furthers this notion of the gallery as a social condenser more than simply a place for exhibition.
So one of the great things about not being co-located is I think our practice ends up having a kind of dialogue that gets established between both practice and teaching and our commission work in pro bono. And the work that Jeff has been able to do with the students out in Nebraska has, I think, really directly influenced and helped us with the work in San Francisco. Around the same time all of the Bemis stuff was getting completed, we had started taking advantage of the big tech boom in San Francisco and started doing work for startups. And usually they want to do everything fast, cheap, and great, which I think you guys alluded to is not possible. So it's not possible. But I think that what was so great about the work that we've been able to do, in fact, is that while very deliberate and there's custom fabrication, the work has been done very quickly with very inexpensive materials. And I think that has really benefited us in some of the work that we've done with office interiors. And also the idea that there's like this sort of huge office space full of desks and junk, but we're really focused on creating these moments of social interaction that are much more concentrated, much more interesting than the sea of desks. This is something we did. It's a parklet, like we like to call it, an interior parklet inside a park. This was for a company that was growing very rapidly and would soon take over this space as desk area. And it's made out of actually OSB and Sin lawn. But then we were also, for other companies, been able to sort of create mobile meeting units, which again rely on CDX plywood, but we've been so interested in how do you create places where people can congregate and gather in like these very large and open plan workspaces. And again, These are something we call the rhombus, and they're able to then be joined and reconfigured to make larger meeting areas as well. And in this interest that has emerged in our practice in creating these sort of interactive objects that bridge something between furniture and architecture, we realize we have a whole category of work that we like to call specialized objects. And this is, I think, an interest we've had that combines our fabrication, interior design, and furniture, but also really relies on interaction by the user to complete. So this is the 3-4-5 table, something we completed for a project in Chicago. And we often like these sort of kinetic features in our projects. This is the Dr. No liquor cabinet, I believe. And we also like these little Easter eggs of being able to hide a desk and work area. And that is something we've been interested in for some time. And these sort of specialized moments that, we rely on the user.
It's an either-or space. You can either work or sleep, but you can't do both.
You can't do both. And then this finally is something that we had completed for Metropolitan Home Magazine, and it's something we call the Stones Table, which again was furthering our interest in this combination of digital and analog production. And all of that, with all the custom furniture that we've done, we've also created another company. This is our third thing, called Mod. We started about 1.5 years ago, and it's been dedicated to designing and hopefully putting into production different pieces of furniture. This is a stacking unit we call Ava, and it can be configured and reconfigured into a variety of forms. So you can see we have a single unit, and it can become either a wall or a tower. And right now, there it is, and we just completed it. It's for sale.
In the lobby after the talk. So the Blue Barn Theater, this is the last project we're going to show. This is a building that we completed in 2015 in September. It's actually 3 projects in one, and it came to us. We were the 3rd architect to work for the Blue Barn, which is usually a bad sign that one might want to think twice about. But this is a very particular client that has a very deep concern about their culture as an institution. They're a nonprofit equity theater in Omaha. They've been there about 25 years. And they were in an old warehouse. They really had a need to grow a little bit, but they were very, very concerned about maintaining the character of their space, not just its image, but the way they improvise daily on their building and in their building. And they didn't want a glossy new contemporary theater, but they did need some upgrades. They certainly needed better stage, restrooms, all of the sort of things that you might expect. The project, in the end, became a combination of 3 different projects. So it sits here south of downtown Omaha, just south of the urban core, at the sort of juncture between a warehouse district and a working class neighborhood that's very rapidly developing. In fact, there's several other projects ongoing in the neighborhood after this was built. So the 3 projects here occupy a half city block. The first one is the Blue Barn Theater itself. And then the neighbor is Boxcar 10. This is another commission, a separate client, completely separate contract, but very related. The owner of Boxcar 10 is a board member of Blue Barn, and she wanted to build a mixed-use building to create a sort of a dynamism in the neighborhood at the same time that the theater opened, thinking that it would support the theater in many ways. And then the third piece was something that came out of our design process. We had this leftover piece of land that wasn't really necessary for the amount of program that we were working with. And we proposed to make that a public open space and to hold a design competition, a national design competition, in order to select a winner. And I'll show that in just a minute. But this project, when you think about the theater itself, goes back to our initial sort of thinking about the neutral space of the white cube. And the sort of converse of that in the theater world is the black box. And the black box is something that emerged in the 50s and 60s with a number of theater artists who were really very interested in creating spaces that were more flexible, where there could be different relationships between actors and audience, apart from this sort of proscenium that we're in right now. And so it's an idea that emerged out of a desire to actually go back to something a little bit more like the Greek theater, where the actors could move around and the audience was on all sides. And then Peter Brook was an influential figure in this world, writing about desire. I called it the empty space, but the empty space wasn't meant to be about neutrality. It was meant to be a space where actor and audience could come together with minimal means. That basically anything could be a theater as long as you had actors and you had audience. This is a really important piece, and it was actually very influential for our client. The quote here is written by Joshua Dax, who is the theater consultant that we worked with, and he was on the job before we became involved. Fisher Dax is the firm here in New York. They're a very prominent theater consultant. And he was critiquing the notion of the black box, which has become ubiquitous. There's obviously one here in this building, as a neutral space. So there was essentially a misunderstanding of the notion of emptiness, to think of it as something neutral. And neutral is a pitfall because it suggests that the space itself has no character, when how can you think of a black box or a white cube as being anything but dominant in your experience of the space? So we started to think about, both of these sort of terms, the white cube and the black box, and trying to think again about this idea that we could have flexibility, but without neutrality. There can be character, and that the theater, it actually can play a role in the staging of certain work. So when we started to work on the project, we think about the sort of volume of program on the site, and sort of metaphorically thinking about the black cube of Boxcar 10 as being the excavation of the theater space starting to emerge out of this block of program. So Boxcar 10 here on the left is 3 floors of apartments above a restaurant, tenant restaurant space. The base of the building appears to be continuous. These are actually separate buildings with separate foundations, separate services, and so on. And then the back side of Boxcar 10 is almost a black and white photograph where the materials are very mute. And unfortunately, someone parked a black car there when we were photographing it, which helped us out a lot. And then the theater becomes a sort of concentric development of space surrounding the actual performance core. You've got the theater, you've got the sort of circulation and the acoustic buffer, then you've got in blue this sort of public zone of circulation around the building, and then the green space started to become part of the conversation in the design of the building, thinking about how that could become an adjunct to the theater itself. The form of the building essentially emerges out of forces from program pushing and drainage needs pushing the other way, creating a kind of inflated roof that's flat on one side and gabled on the other. And then through the competition, the winners of the competition, El Dorado Architects and Urban Rain Design, a landscape studio, proposed creating the green space as essentially a collapsing of the roof to create a slope for watching performances at the back of the theater, but also thinking of this as a way to collect rainwater from the roof of the building and use that to irrigate the gardens, and maybe turn that into a performance event as well. So in the end, this becomes a sort of an infrastructural machine for theater that allows the theater as a black box to expand out into this green space. So here's the plan. You can see the theater in black, obviously, with fixed seating and with a stage. So it has some traditional aspects to it, and then some very untraditional ways that it starts to engage the environment. Just geometrically, it starts with the property line, and then there's the box of Boxcar 10, and then the roof form pretty much doesn't pay a whole lot of attention to what's going on in the program at some point, and then you can see the garden kind of running through in the end. And then the roof of the building originally was going to be a green roof, but the city of Omaha wasn't terribly happy about that. The fire marshal told us it was the stupidest thing he'd ever heard of, putting grass on your roof. So we sort of stopped pushing that idea. And it will eventually be artificial turf. That was left out of the construction because of budget reasons, but it'll come back as an artificial turf roof at some point. And then at the backside, you can see the green space here starting. This is right after construction, so the green space hasn't really evolved yet. But you can see that the theater starts to open up into that space when the gates are open. On the north side, on the street, the building follows the grade slightly, the sort of gentle slope of the street, as a sort of blank wall, almost a sort of diaphanous curtain over windows. And here we started to really become interested in a quality of materiality on the building that evolved over time. So Corten steel, of course, is a natural solution for a material that's both evolutionary, but also fairly affordable to maintain. And this sort of began as an interest in trying to think about how we can reintroduce materiality to architecture. Most of you who are working architects probably know that American construction is based on the notion of products, and most contractors want to know what the product is and who holds the warranty and so on and so forth. It's very hard to get a general contractor to really work with materials. And so we proposed hanging rebar in front of the building as a sort of a way to create a layering effect over the Corten panels. And they kept trying everything they could do to find a product that they could stick on the building that would kind of look like rebar, but they never could. So we actually won the argument with them because they had no alternatives that were anywhere near this. So I won't go into the long story of how this came together, but it ended up becoming a process of welding individual bars, top and bottom, and at the mid-rail all the way around the building, so about 3,000 rebar lengths around the building. We tried to propose panels and a whole other series of things, but this is what they wanted to do. At the entry porch on the street side, the rebar pulls away from the building, so one can actually occupy a space between the bar and the building itself. And this exemplifies one of the things that really helped us secure this client's interest, and that we made it very easy for them to think about ways they could modify the building by themselves. So after construction was done, they added this logo with spun rebar, and they welded it on themselves. I don't know, we took a lot of photos before they did that just in case, but it actually doesn't look that bad. And then, as you can see towards the entry, the color of the interior comes out. The rebar stops at Boxcar 10, so Boxcar 10 has the same Corten cladding, but without the rebar over the face. One of the other aspects of our project that won the commission for us was that we proposed to give up a reasonable amount of our fee to a series of artists who would be commissioned to design and build components of the building with minimal input from us. So unlike a conventional artist relationship with a building where someone comes in and they're commissioning a work that might hang on a wall or sit on a floor, this was actually part of the necessary components of the building. So one component here is the vestibule. The brick in the vestibule was custom made by an artist named Michael Morgan. He's a ceramic artist from Britain who works out of Pittsburgh, and he used Nebraska clay, Endicott clay, so we had clay pavers from the same source, and he worked with that clay, glazed it, and created a bench and a series of walls that one moves through as the public enters the building, and the box office actually occupies that space. And then another artist, Daniel Tober, who works in a number of media, but one of the things he's been doing is harvesting salvaged wood from around Omaha. And he produced the cladding for the theater itself from sawmill cutoff, so it was all free material. And heavy timbers, those two 16-foot long, 16-inch square oak timbers, which were felled trees that he found in Omaha, salvaged and milled to create a series of furniture pieces throughout the space. And then Jim Woodfill, who's an artist from Kansas City, was commissioned to build millwork as well as custom lighting that works sort of dynamically throughout the public spaces using very simple off-the-shelf unistrut and floodlights. And then in the theater, the more of the milled columns, and these are salvaged from trees that have been fallen by various high windstorms in Omaha over the last couple of years, milled by Daniel, and then installed. These are non-structural, but they actually work to frame the space in the theater itself. And this was a suggestion of Joshua Dax that to bring the scale of the theater down from the bigger component, the bigger space that we had actually designed. And then the seats are salvaged from 2 different theaters. They've moved twice from different locations. This is an early rendering of the north facade, and then you can see how the section works with that, the theater in the center, and then the lobby and the outdoor performance yard, which is an outdoor space that is covered between the theater and the green space. And this really allows the building to open up dynamically in both directions. So the theater, on one hand, could be your sort of standard fixed seat, proscenium and stage, or you could do something like an alley theater set up with seating on both sides of the stage, an arena stage set up with seating all the way around the stage, or move everything outside and have a performance of the same character in the exterior environment. The theater here, you can see the entire space with the seats. It's only about 10 more seats than their previous space, so this was not a grand enlargement of the company, but just a new space that works a lot better for them. So thinking about how that space is really composed, we sort of went back to the notion of the proscenium as a frame. So you have fixed seat, you have frame, and then you have stage. And so we thought about expanding this into a series of parallel frames that created different opportunities for theater artists to stage shows in very different ways. So they can pretty much occupy any zone within this. And then there's a cyclorama curtain that would operate around the stage so that you can open the stage on any side. And then just the components, rigging steel and the roof and the acoustic walls and all of the other things that make a theater work. But probably the most interesting part of the theater itself is the door that opens up to the back. This was another artist commission. We hired a guy named Chris Kemp, who's sort of a mechanical genius in Omaha. And we asked him to build, well, so here's a situation where we talked to the contractor. We need a 34-foot wide, 12-foot tall, multi-swing door. And they were coming back with $150,000, $200, blah, 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 blah. This guy said he'd build it for $12,000. But we gave him 20 just to be sure that there weren't problems. He custom made every hinge, every component of these doors, including the sort of sand cast aluminum handles, the door knobs. Essentially, these are 16-inch wide handles that you turn, and all the mechanisms are entirely custom made in his shop. And these doors work perfectly well. And the idea was that an actor could use this as part of the performance. It's not simply a mechanical door that operates, by the push of a button, but it's something that can be operated live. And so then it opens up completely or partially to the performance porchyard. So here's an actual performance shot. You can see the stage and then the green space outside. So the idea here being that the black box, thinking of it as a sort of hermetically sealed performance space separated from the world, here the city can be allowed to participate in the actual performance itself. So there's a rail line nearby. A train goes by during a performance, it becomes part of the show. And then this is a view from the backside of the porchyard from the green space itself. And then finally, an image of the north side of the building with the sort of light effect from at the base of the rebar wall. So, E.B., you want to?
So, just to conclude, we're back to the image of the art farm. And I think what we've loved about the Blue Barn is that this project really represents a culmination of all the ideas that we've had in our practice together. Programmatic invention, materiality, color, this sort of idea of giving up control. But I don't think we could have possibly done something like the Blue Barn without the work that we've done, say, like at Art Farm with Bemis, where in our minds, it's a very similar process. It was, thinking of a master plan, realizing there was site-specific art that was going to be done at, say, Art Farm or to house artists at Bemis. But this was more embodied in actually an architecture project. And I think that it's been really interesting for us in this whole process to think about how do you give physical form and transfer or move an institution from its one physical location to another, rather than actually moving the building itself. And in the end, I think we also wanted to give a huge thank you to all the people who have worked with us over the years. As Jeff has mentioned, we have a lot of fabricators and artists we've just mentioned, but we also, you can see from the work, we clearly do not do this on our own. We have an amazing staff, people who've worked with us now and have worked with us in the past, some of whom are here, and all the students who've worked with us through FACT. We also wanted to give a huge thank you to. And I also want to give a huge thank you to my family and my mother, who is sitting in the audience too. Thank you.
Thank you.